It is a truth generally acknowledged that a long and happy marriage is a fortress against the sorrows of the world. For 48 years, the union of Lord Gideon Ashworth, the Earl of Penhaligon, and his wife, Lady Constance, had appeared to all of society as just such a fortress, impenetrable, serene, and built upon a foundation of unwavering devotion. Lord Gideon loved his wife with a depth and sincerity that was the envy of all who knew them. He was a man of impeccable honor, a pillar of his community, and a father whose kindness was as boundless as his lands. But the strongest fortresses can be built upon the most unstable ground, and the great love of Lord Gideon's life was also the cause of his greatest lie. For the secret was a child, his own illegitimate son, born of a terrible mistake, whom he had brought into the very heart of his home under the cloak of a noble lie. To his beloved wife, and to the world, he had claimed the boy was a cherished ward, the orphaned son of a dear friend. This act of charity, which had been praised as a testament to his good character, was in fact a 28-year-long deception, a daily betrayal that walked the very halls of his home. He protected this lie as fiercely as he protected his wife's heart, telling himself it was for her that he lived this double life, when in truth he was simply a prisoner of his own past, praying for a judgment that never came. But secrets, like all living things, cannot be contained forever. They grow in the dark, seeking the light. And the secret at the heart of Penhaligon House was about to come of age. The light, slanting through the tall drawing-room windows of Penhaligon House, caught the silver threads in Lady Constance's gracefully pinned hair. It was a golden afternoon in late summer, the day of their 48th wedding anniversary, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and a quiet, settled contentment. She sat upon the damask settee, her hand resting in her husband's, her smile as serene as it had been on the day he had first placed a ring upon her finger. Opposite them, seated closely by the pianoforte, were the two souls who constituted the whole of their world. Their daughter, Jessamine, a graceful woman of 22, and their ward, Lachlan, now a man of 28. 48 years, my dear, Gideon said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that had comforted Constance for a lifetime. He lifted her hand to his lips. And I have loved you every day. Constance's heart swelled with the familiar, happy warmth. And I you, Gideon? More than ever. Her gaze drifted to the younger couple. Lachlan was no longer the brooding boy she had raised, but a man of substance, his shoulders broad, and his gaze steady and assured. He was speaking in a low murmur to Jessamine, who listened with the easy, radiant confidence of a woman deeply in love. He reached out, his gesture unhurried and familiar, and gently tucked a stray auburn curl behind her ear. It was a gesture of profound, settled intimacy. Gideon's smile tightened at the edges. He has managed the estate with remarkable skill. The thought was a shield, an attempt to keep the man in his professional place, but the quiet possession in that gesture. It was not that of an employee or a ward. It was that of a future husband. They have grown into such fine adults, Constance murmured, her voice filled with a mother's pride. As if on cue, Lachlan stood, his movements deliberate and assured. Jessamine rose with him, her hand slipping into his, not with girlish excitement, but with the quiet strength of a partner. He met Gideon's eyes across the room, his expression respectful, but firm. "My lord," Lachlan began, his voice clear and resonant, "for the better part of my life, you have afforded me every opportunity, for which I am deeply grateful. For the past several years, I have had the honor of managing this estate, and I hope I have earned your respect, not just as your ward, but as a man." He paused, his gaze flicking to Jessamine, his expression softening into pure adoration. "My feelings for your daughter have grown into a love I intend to honor for the rest of my life. I come to you today, as the head of this house, and as the man I respect most, to formally state my intention to marry her, and to ask for your blessing upon our union." The air crackled with joyous silence. Constance's face broke into a radiant smile, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, Gideon, isn't it wonderful?" Gideon did not look at his wife. His eyes were locked on Lachlan, and the warmth had drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of cold, impenetrable stone. The room, which seconds before had felt warm and full of light, was suddenly icy. "No," Gideon said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. Jessamine's smile faltered, her hand tightening in Lachlan's. "Father?" "Absolutely not," Gideon stated, his voice devoid of all emotion. He released Constance's hand and stood, his full height seeming to cast a shadow over them all. "The matter is not open for discussion. Such a union is an impossibility. It will not happen. Not now. Not ever." He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving 3 other adults frozen in stunned, uncomprehending silence. The silence Gideon left behind in the drawing room of Penhaligon House was a living thing, heavy, cold, and suffocating. For a long, stunned moment, no one moved. The golden afternoon light still slanted through the windows, the scent of roses still hung in the air. But the warmth had been vacuumed from the room, replaced by a chilling disbelief. The delicate porcelain teacups on the silver tray seemed to mock them with their placid elegance. An anniversary celebration had become an execution. Constance was the first to stir. The serene contentment that had filled her heart only moments before had curdled into a tight, painful knot of confusion. She looked from her husband's empty doorway to her daughter. Jessamine stood frozen, her hand still linked with Lachlan's, her beautiful features a mask of devastation. The color had drained from her cheeks, but at 22, her shock was hardening into a defiant anger. "Mama!" Jessamine's voice was a fragile whisper, but it was laced with an edge of disbelief that bordered on outrage. Constance's own heart was a frantic, fluttering bird in her chest, but 48 years as the lady of this house had taught her to be the calm center in any storm. She rose from the settee, her movements graceful despite the tremor in her hands, and went to her daughter. She placed a hand on Jessamine's arm, a gesture not of coddling a child, but of supporting a fellow woman. "There has been a gross misunderstanding," Constance said, her voice firm, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Your father is mistaken." She looked over Jessamine's shoulder at Lachlan. The raw hurt in his dark eyes was a physical blow, but at 28 it was layered with the deep, personal insult of a capable man whose worth had just been publicly denied. He had not made a boy's plea, but a man's declaration, only to be dismissed as if he were a child. His jaw was tight, a muscle clenching in controlled restraint. In that moment, Constance's heart ached for his wounded pride as much as for her daughter's broken heart. She gave Jessamine's arm a final, reassuring squeeze. "Stay here. I will speak with him." Leaving the 2 of them in the wreckage of their future, Constance turned and walked towards the hall. With each step on the polished oak floor, her own carefully constructed composure began to fray. Gideon had never, in nearly 5 decades of marriage, been cruel. He was a man of principle, of honor. His refusal was not just a father's disapproval, it was an act of tyranny, a violent departure from the character of the man she knew. Her mind raced as she made her way to his study, the long corridor seeming to stretch before her. She searched for a logical explanation. Was it about station? A foolish, antiquated notion. and one Gideon had never subscribed to. Lachlan, while not titled, had proven his merit tenfold as the manager of their entire estate. Was it money? Lachlan was not wealthy, but he was a responsible and capable man. Was Gideon unwell? The thought felt less likely now. This had not been the act of a confused mind, but one of cold, deliberate intent. She remembered, with a clarity that was painful, the day he had arrived home with Lachlan. The memory was as vivid as the damask wallpaper she now passed. It had been a dreary, rain-lashed evening in autumn, 28 years ago. She had been in this very hall when the heavy front doors had opened. Gideon had stood there, soaked and weary, his face a mask of grief she had never seen before. In his arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was an infant. He had stepped inside, the wind howling behind him, and placed the infant in her arms. His words had been so clear, so honourable. "He has no one, Constance. My dearest friend, William and his wife. Both gone. A carriage accident on the North Road. William named me his guardian in his letters. We must raise him as our own." And she had. She had loved the boy from that first moment. And Gideon, too, had been a fine and loving guardian, providing for Lachlan in every way, celebrating his successes, entrusting him with the running of their very livelihood. There had never been a hint of resentment. So what had changed? What dark reason could he have to deny the union of two adults he had raised and loved? She reached the heavy oak door of his study, his sanctuary. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed the front of her gown, and turned the cold brass handle. He was standing with his back to her, staring out the bay window. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. He did not turn as she entered. "Gideon," she said, her voice firm. "You will explain yourself." "There is nothing to explain," he replied, his tone flat. "Nothing?" She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing the shutting of a box. "You have just publicly insulted the man who runs your estate and shattered the heart of your daughter. You have behaved like a stranger to me. And you say there is nothing to explain? Lachlan is not a suitable match." The excuse was so weak, it was an insult to her intelligence. Not suitable? A man of his character, his integrity? A man you have entrusted with our entire fortune? This is not about his suitability. What is the real reason? He turned then, and his face was a fortress of cold stone. "I cannot give my blessing, because they have been raised under this roof as brother and sister. The bond they share is sacred, and it is not the bond of a husband and wife. To transform it would be unseemly." Constance stared at him, incredulous. "Unseemly?" "They are adults, Gideon. They have never once viewed each other as siblings, and you know it. Their love is the most natural thing in the world. That is an excuse, not a reason." Feeling his first argument crumble, he grew colder. "Very well. Lachlan is a fine man, but his origins, honourable as they may be, are not equal to ours. His father was a second son with no title. A marriage for a daughter of Penhaligon House must be an alliance of equals. His bloodline is not sufficient." The cruelty of it stole her breath. His bloodline? The blood of the man you called your dearest friend. You wept for that man, Gideon. You have spent a lifetime honouring his memory, and now you use his humble birth as a weapon to deny his son happiness? The hypocrisy is astounding. I do not recognize the man standing before me. "My decision is final," he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "I demand you trust my judgment." "Trust your judgment?" The words felt like ash in her mouth. "I have trusted your judgment for 48 years, but trust is not blind obedience. It is earned through honesty. What you are asking for now is not trust. It is submission. and I do not know why you believe you are entitled to it." A flicker of pain crossed his features before being suppressed. He looked away from her, turning back to the window. "I will not discuss it further, Constance." It was a dismissal, a locked door, a line drawn between them that had never existed before. The problem was no longer his inexplicable refusal. It was the terrifying realization that she was married to a man she did not know at all. She stood in the center of his study, the room suddenly feeling alien and cold. She could fight him. She could scream. She could break down in tears. But she knew with a sickening finality that it would be useless. The man before her was unreachable. Without another word, she turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned her back against the cool wood of the corridor, pressing a hand to her chest to still the frantic beating of her heart. She had gone in seeking an explanation. She had come out with a far more terrible burden, a certainty that her husband was hiding a secret so dark it had turned him into a stranger. The heavy drawing-room door clicked shut, leaving Jessamine and Lachlan alone in the echoing silence. For a moment, they simply stood, their hands still clasped, a small island in the vast, sunlit room. The shock of Gideon's pronouncement was a physical presence, a cold weight that seemed to press the very air from their lungs. Jessamine was the first to pull her hand away, not from Lachlan, but to wrap her arms around herself, as if a sudden, icy wind had swept through the room. "He cannot mean it," she said, her voice low and seething with a disbelief that was rapidly curdling into anger. "He cannot possibly mean it." At 22, she was past the age of accepting a father's decree without question. This was not a paternal denial of a youthful fancy. It was an attack on a future she had considered a certainty, on a love that felt as essential as breathing. Lachlan watched her, his own heart a leaden weight in his chest. The insult was a raw, gaping wound. For years he had meticulously managed every acre of this estate, every tenant farm, every shilling in the ledgers, all driven by a profound sense of gratitude and a quiet, desperate need to prove his worth. He had believed he had succeeded. He had believed he had earned Gideon's respect as a man. To be dismissed so coldly, so absolutely, felt like a negation of his entire life. He was not himself, Lachlan said, though the words felt like a lie. He was trying to find a logical reason where none existed. Perhaps there is some financial trouble with the estate he has kept hidden? A worry that makes the thought of a wedding seem ill-timed? Financial trouble. Jessamine turned to him, her eyes flashing. And his solution is to be cruel. To speak to you as if you were a stranger? Number. This is not about money. This is something else. Something ugly. Before they could say more, the door opened, and Constance re-entered the room. The sight of her mother's face extinguished the last of Jessamine's hope. Constance was a woman of impeccable composure, yet she was visibly shattered. Her face was pale, her eyes held a new and terrifying darkness, and her hands were clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white. "Mama, what did he say?" Jessamine asked, rushing to her side. Constance looked from her daughter to Lachlan, and her expression was one of profound sorrow and confusion. He will not be reasoned with," she said, her voice strained. "He speaks of propriety, of your stations. He speaks nonsense. I do not understand it. It is as if a stranger has taken his place." She reached out and cupped Jessamine's cheek. "Be patient, my love. His heart is clouded by something I cannot see." But Jessamine saw no room for patience. She looked at Lachlan, and a silent understanding passed between them. They could not wait for a storm to pass. They had to walk into its heart. "We will speak to him ourselves," Jessamine declared, her chin held high. She took Lachlan's hand again, her grip firm and resolute. Together, they found Gideon in his study. He was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, a ledger open before him, a pen in his hand. He was feigning work, projecting an aura of unshakable authority, as if the emotional devastation he had just caused was a trivial matter already forgotten. He did not look up as they entered. "Father," Jessamine began, her voice trembling slightly but clear as a bell, "we have come for an explanation. An honest one." Gideon slowly placed his pen down, his movements deliberate. He looked up, his face as cold and unforgiving as it had been in the drawing room. "There is nothing more to be said. I gave you my answer. An answer without a reason is not an answer. It is a decree," Lachlan said, his voice respectful but firm. At 28, he would not be cowed like a boy. "And we are no longer children, my lord. We deserve the dignity of a reason." Gideon's eyes narrowed. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Very well. You wish for a reason. I cannot give my blessing because you have been raised under this very roof as brother and sister. The bond you share is a familial one. To twist it into a romance would be unseemly. That is a falsehood, and you know it." Jessamine shot back, her respect for her father warring with her fury. "We have never been siblings. He was always your ward, and I your daughter. Our affection was built on a foundation of friendship, not fraternity. We have done nothing unseemly. With all due respect, my lord," Lachlan added, his tone calm and logical, "our feelings for one another are the furthest thing from a familial bond. To suggest otherwise is to willfully ignore the truth of our lives." Cornered, Gideon's facade of paternal concern crumbled, revealing the cold stone beneath. He directed his next words to Jessamine, but his cruel gaze was fixed on Lachlan. "Then I will give you another reason. A marriage for a daughter of Penhaligon House is an alliance of families. Lachlan, honorable though he may be, brings no name to this union. His bloodline, respectable as his father's was, is not sufficient." The air left the room. It was a devastating, calculated blow. To use the memory of the friend he had supposedly cherished as a weapon was an act of profound hypocrisy. Jessamine stared at her father, horrified. "Sufficient?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "After all he has done for this family, for you? After you yourself taught us that a man's character is his true legacy? How can you say such a thing?" "I say it because it is the truth," Gideon said, his voice like ice. "I have made my decision, and it is final. It is my duty as your father to protect you from a choice you will come to regret." "This is not protection," Jessamine cried, tears of anger and betrayal finally streaming down her face. "This is cruelty." Gideon stood, his patience clearly at an end. He placed his hands flat on the desk, his authority absolute. "The matter is closed. I will not have this union. And I suggest you remember your place in this house, Lachlan. You are here by my generosity. Do not make me regret it." The threat, unspoken but deeply understood, hung in the air between them. Lachlan met Gideon's gaze, his face a mask of pained dignity. He gave a single, formal bow. "My lord?" He then turned to Jessamine, his eyes softening. "Come," he said gently. "There is nothing more to be said here." He led her from the room, leaving Gideon standing alone in his fortress of lies. They did not speak until they had reached the stone balustrade of the west terrace, the setting sun casting long, sorrowful shadows across the manicured lawns. Jessamine leaned against the cool stone, her tears spent, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. "He is not the man I thought he was," she said, her voice flat. "That man in there is a stranger." Lachlan stood beside her, looking out at the estate he managed, the home that had never truly been his. "He is hiding something," he said. "A reason so terrible he is willing to become a monster to protect it." She turned to him then, her eyes clear and fierce. She took his hands in hers. "Then we will not let him. I will not let him destroy us with his secrets. I love you, Lachlan, and I love you, he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. He lifted her hands to his lips. I will not lose you. You won't, she vowed, her voice as hard as the stone beneath her fingers. No matter what it takes. They stood together as dusk fell. No longer a hopeful couple seeking a blessing, but allies united against a tyrant they did not understand. The fight had just begun. A week passed at Penhaligon House, each day a landscape of quiet, simmering hostility. The grand rooms, usually filled with the warmth of family life, were now spaces of strategic avoidance. Meals were eaten in a tense, formal silence, the clinking of silver against porcelain, the only sound punctuating the vast emptiness between them. Gideon maintained an air of unassailable authority, Constance an armor of icy civility. Jessamine and Lachlan, in the presence of her parents, were models of propriety, but the glances that passed between them were filled with a shared, defiant fire. It was a cold war, fought in the silent corridors and averted gazes of a home that had become a prison. The first volley in a new campaign was fired on a Tuesday morning over breakfast. Gideon, after crisply turning a page of his newspaper, addressed his wife without looking at her. I have invited a guest for dinner this Friday, he announced, his tone falsely casual. Mr. Alistair Hemlock. He is the son of Lord Ashworth, from the neighbouring county, a fine young man with excellent prospects. Constance slowly placed her teacup in its saucer, the delicate clink a sharp note of discord. She met her husband's eyes over the top of the silver toast rack. And for what purpose does this fine young man visit, Gideon? Surely not for your company, as you have been so thoroughly enjoying your own of late. The sarcasm, a weapon she rarely wielded, struck its mark. A muscle twitched in Gideon's jaw. He is of an age with Jessamine, he said, his voice hardening. It is past time she began to receive suitable callers. I am merely fulfilling my duty as a father. It was a declaration of his strategy. If Jessamine would not choose a suitable husband, he would choose one for her. Constance felt a cold fury rise within her. He was not just a tyrant. He was a fool if he thought their daughter's heart was a fortress that could be taken by such a clumsy siege. Your duty as a father seems to have taken a remarkably cruel turn, she said, before rising from the table. I shall instruct the cook. She found Jessamine in the morning room, arranging a bouquet of late summer roses, her brow furrowed in concentration. Constance watched her for a moment. This vibrant, strong-willed woman who was the best of both her parents. The thought of what Gideon was attempting to do, to break her spirit, to force her into a loveless match, was monstrous. Your father has invited a guest to dinner on Friday, Constance said, her voice gentle. Jessamine looked up, a thorn pricking her finger. She winced, placing the digit in her mouth. And who is this unfortunate soul? A Mr. Hemlock, son of Lord Ashworth. Jessamine's eyes narrowed as she understood the implication. She gave a short, bitter laugh. A suitor, of course. Does he truly believe he can replace Lachlan with some titled bore? That he can simply present me with a more suitable man, and I will forget my own heart? She placed a deep crimson rose into the vase with a sharp, definitive jab. He will be sorely mistaken. The dinner on Friday was an excruciating exercise in politeness. Mr. Alistair Hemlock was precisely as Gideon had described him, handsome in a bland sort of way, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a fortune that was a great deal larger than his personality. He was not a villain. He was simply a product of his class, utterly oblivious to the family drama he had been invited to witness. The tension in the grand dining room was thick enough to carve. Gideon played the gracious host, his voice booming with a forced bonhomie, as he tried, repeatedly, to draw Jessamine and the guest into conversation. "Mr. Hemlock, I believe you share Jessamine's appreciation for Italian poetry, do you not?" "I have read some, my lord," Mr. Hemlock stammered, clearly unused to such direct social maneuvering. "And what are your thoughts, my dear?" Gideon prompted, smiling at his daughter. Jessamine, who had been staring at her plate, looked up. She offered Mr. Hemlock a smile that was all teeth. "I find it is a subject best discussed by those who are truly passionate about it," she said, before turning her attention to the other end of the table. "Lachlan, did you say the east pasture requires drainage before winter?" The shift was so abrupt, so pointedly dismissive of the guest of honor, that a flush crept up Mr. Hemlock's neck. Lachlan, seated in his designated place as estate manager, a position that felt more like a social exile tonight than ever before, was forced to answer. "Yes, Miss Jessamine. The lower fields are already showing signs of waterlogging." "A fascinating subject, I'm sure," Gideon interjected, his voice strained. Constance, for her part, was a portrait of icy perfection. She guided the conversation with the skill of a seasoned hostess, ensuring no awkward silences could last too long, yet she offered her husband no support. Her politeness to Mr. Hemlock was flawless, but her silence towards Gideon was a weapon. She would not be an accomplice to this cruelty. Lachlan felt as though he were on a stage, playing a part in a humiliating farce. He was intensely aware of Gideon's eyes on him, watching for any sign of impropriety. He kept his own gaze lowered, his posture rigid, his answers to any direct questions brief and formal. Every moment was a torment. He had to sit and listen to this vapid stranger be presented as a worthy replacement for him, had to endure Gideon's pointed praise of Mr. Hemlock's fine lineage, a clear and deliberate insult to his own. The roast beef on his plate tasted like ash. He could feel Jessamine's frustration and her loyalty in every pointed question she sent his way, and it was all he could do not to meet her gaze. Knowing that the connection they shared would be a fire, Gideon was desperate to extinguish. The evening finally, mercifully, drew to a close. Mr. Hemlock, thoroughly bewildered by the undercurrents he could not comprehend, made his polite farewells, promising to call again, a promise everyone at the table, save for Gideon, knew would not be kept. As the sound of his carriage faded down the long drive, Jessamine spun on her father, her composure shattering like glass. "How dare you?" she seethed, her voice low and trembling with rage. "How dare you humiliate me, humiliate Lachlan, and humiliate yourself with such a transparent and insulting charade?" Gideon's face was hard, the mask of the genial host gone. "I will not have you speak to me in that tone. Mr. Hemlock is a fine man. You would do well to show him more respect. I will not be sold like livestock to the highest bidder. You are a daughter of this house, and you will learn to do your duty," he retorted, his voice cold as steel. "This is only the beginning. I will see you suitably married if it is the last thing I do." He turned and strode from the room, leaving Jessamine trembling in his wake. A moment later, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hall. It was Lachlan. He said nothing, but walked to her side. He did not touch her. Not under this roof. Not anymore. But his presence was enough. She looked at him, her anger dissolving into a shared, aching sorrow. In their shared glance was a silent vow. The lines had been drawn. Reason had failed, and open battle had been declared. From now on, their love would have to become a secret, a rebellion fought in the shadows of the house that was no longer a home. The days that followed the disastrous dinner settled into a new and terrible rhythm. Penhaligon House, once a sanctuary of warmth and affection, became a landscape of surveillance and suspicion. A cold war was waged at the breakfast table, where Gideon would read his newspaper like a barricade, and in the drawing room, where Constance would busy herself with needlepoint, each stitch a small, silent act of condemnation. Jessamine and Lachlan moved through these spaces like ghosts, their interactions in the open meticulously formal, their words clipped and polite. They were never left alone. If Jessamine was in the garden, her mother would invariably appear with a basket and shears. If Lachlan was in the library consulting a map of the estate, Gideon would enter to sharpen a pen, his presence a suffocating weight. But in this cold, oppressive atmosphere, a secret language blossomed, a shared glance across the dining table that said, "I am with you," a brief, almost imperceptible nod in a hallway that meant, "Be strong." Love denied the open air. Learn to thrive in the shadows. Their rebellion began not with a bang, but with a book. One afternoon, Jessamine was in the library, ostensibly looking for a volume of poetry. She saw Lachlan enter, his face set in the serious, professional mask he now wore at all times. He went to a shelf of agricultural ledgers, pulled one out, and after a moment, replaced it. He met her eyes for a brief, electric second before turning and leaving. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was a signal. She waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before going to the shelf. Tucked inside the ledger was a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was his, strong, decisive and familiar. The old summer house. At moonrise. That night, the house felt more like a prison than ever. Jessamine feigned a headache after dinner and retired to her room early, her heart a frantic drum against the silence. She watched the moon climb the sky, a sliver of silver in the inky blackness. When the house was still, she slipped from her room, her stockinged feet making no sound on the thick carpets. She moved through the sleeping corridors like a wraith, down a servant's staircase, and out a small door in the scullery that was never locked. The night air was cool and clean, a blessed relief from the suffocating tension indoors. She ran across the damp lawn, the moonlight guiding her towards the far edge of the gardens, where the old summer house stood. A forgotten relic of a happier time, shrouded in ivy. He was waiting for her inside. The moment she slipped through the door, he had her in his arms, his embrace fierce and desperate. It was the first time they had truly touched in what felt like a lifetime, and the relief was so profound, it felt like pain. She buried her face in the rough wool of his jacket, breathing in the familiar scent of earth and leather that was uniquely his. "I thought I would go mad," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know," he murmured into her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "To see you every day and not be able to even speak to you." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. In the dim, moonlit interior of the summer house, his dark eyes searched hers. "Jessamine, what are we to do?" He will not relent. "Then neither will we," she said, her voice fierce. "Lachlan, I have been thinking. That man in the study, that was not my father, not the man who raised us. He is afraid. The excuses he gave, my station, your bloodline, they were lies. Pathetic, cruel lies to hide something else." "I agree," Lachlan said, his brow furrowed. "I have gone over every ledger, every decision I have made for the estate. There is no failure, no mistake he could hold against me. It cannot be about my work." He shook his head, a deep frustration in his eyes. "It is something deeper, a fear I have never seen in him." "Then we cannot fight it with reason," she concluded. "He has left us no honorable path. We must make our own." "And what path is that?" he asked, his gaze intense. "To wait," she said, her hands a tightening on his arms. "To be patient. And to never, ever let him win. We will meet here. We will find a way. Promise me you will not accept the post in India if he offers it again. Promise me you will not leave." "Leave you?" The thought was so absurd to him that he almost laughed. "Jessamine, you are the only home I have ever truly had. I would sooner stop breathing." He leaned in and kissed her then, a kiss that was not the gentle caress of a courtship, but the desperate, claiming act of two souls clinging to each other in a storm. It was a promise, a vow, and a declaration of war. Their secret meetings became their lifeline. Not every night, but whenever they could manage it, they would find their way to the summer house. They spoke of the future, a fragile, imagined thing they pieced together in the dark. They planned for a life away from Penhaligon House, a small estate of their own, funded by the inheritance from his parents that Gideon had always managed on his behalf. Their love, forged in the light of a happy childhood, was now being tempered into something harder and more resilient in the fires of adversity. The danger was constant. One evening, Lachlan was returning to the main house long after midnight, his path taking him through the west wing. As he rounded a corner, a lamp was suddenly lit in the hall ahead. It was Gideon, standing in his dressing gown, the lamplight casting his face in harsh, demonic shadows. Lachlan froze, his heart seizing in his chest. "You are out late, Lachlan," Gideon said, his voice deceptively mild. "My lord," Lachlan replied, forcing his own voice to remain steady. "I could not sleep. I was checking the locks on the stables. I thought I heard a noise." Gideon stared at him, his eyes boring into him, searching for the lie. The silence stretched for an agonizingly long moment. "Indeed," Gideon finally said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "See that you are not so restless in the future. A man in your position requires his sleep." He turned and walked away, leaving Lachlan trembling in the dark, the unspoken threat, "I am watching you," hanging in the air. The near miss only strengthened their resolve. They became more careful, their signals more subtle, their moments together more precious. They were no longer just a couple in love. They were co-conspirators, rebels fighting for their own sovereignty against a king who had become a tyrant. Their love story was being written in whispers, in stolen glances, and in secret vows made under the moon, a testament to a bond that refused to be broken. Autumn began to bleed into the landscape of Penhaligon House, painting the ancient oaks in hues of gold and rust. The days grew shorter, the air sharper, and the mood within the grand stone walls grew colder still. The house had become a chessboard, and Gideon was a king who felt the insidious creep of checkmate. He knew, with the instinct of a patriarch whose authority had never before been questioned, that they were defying him. He would watch them from the bay window of his study, the very window from which he had delivered his cold edicts. He saw Lachlan in the distance, a commanding figure on horseback, directing the tenant farmers with an air of competence that grated on Gideon's nerves. The man was no longer a boy to be moulded. He was a force in his own right, his roots sunk deep into the soil of the estate. Gideon saw the respect the workers afforded him, the easy way he managed the complex machinery of their livelihood, and a bitter, irrational resentment began to fester. This man, who owed him everything, was now a rival. He saw Jessamine too. The vibrant, easygoing spirit of his daughter had been replaced by a cool, watchful poise. She was polite, she was dutiful in her domestic routines, but her heart was a locked room to which he no longer had the key. He would see them at opposite ends of a long corridor, and a glance would pass between them. So fleeting, so subtle that anyone else might miss it. But Gideon did not. He saw the shared promise in those glances, the secret alliance, and the silent rebellion against him. The house was no longer his kingdom. It was contested territory. His nights became sleepless. He would lie awake for hours, the silence of the house pressing in on him, his mind a churning whee of suspicion, and a much older, deeper guilt. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, and the bars were beginning to feel brittle. It was during one of these long, dark nights, as he stood in his study long after the last embers in the fireplace had died, that the memory surfaced. He was watching the grounds from his window, a habit he had adopted, as if he were a watchman on a castle wall. He saw a lone figure moving with a swift, confident. He was watching the grounds from his window, a habit he had adopted, as if he were a watchman on a castle wall. He saw a lone figure moving with a swift, confident stride across the moon-blanched lawn, heading for a side entrance. It was Lachlan. Returning from God knew where. The sheer confidence of the man, the way he moved as if this land belonged to him, sparked a hot, visceral anger in Gideon's chest. He was staring at Lachlan's retreating back as he disappeared into the house, and his mind, agitated and grasping for leverage, for any past sign of Lachlan's untrustworthy nature, plunged backward in time. Not to a grand event, but to a trivial, half-forgotten moment from 2 decades ago. The memory was startlingly vivid. The air in the village bakery was warm and thick with the scent of yeast and baking bread, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Lachlan, a quiet and observant boy of 8, was holding his hand, his small fingers clutched tightly in Gideon's grasp. They were waiting to purchase a loaf for the cook. The baker, a cheerful, flour-dusted man named Miller, leaned over the counter. "Morning, my lord. Been a long time since we've seen you in the village yourself." Miller's eyes dropped to the boy. "My, is that your boy? How he's grown. A fine, sturdy lad." Gideon felt a familiar, subtle clenching in his gut, the reflexive defense of his lie. "This is my ward, Miller, young Lachlan." "Ah, of course," the baker said, though his eyes still held a hint of confusion. Just then, the shop bell jingled, a merry, discordant sound. A woman entered, holding the hand of a boy of a similar age. Gideon glanced over, a polite, dismissive lord of the manor, and then he froze. He knew her. She was thinner, her face etched with a weariness that had not been there before, her clothes simple and worn. But it was unmistakably her, Nurse Agnes, the head nurse from that dreadful lying-in home on the coast, the woman who had placed the infant Lachlan in his arms. Miller, oblivious, chuckled. "Looks like you've got 2 of them today, my lord," he joked, gesturing with his floury thumb towards the nurse's son. Gideon gave a small, forced laugh. He opened his mouth to greet her, a polite smile forming, the kind one uses for a former servant. "Nurse Agnes, is that you? I had not heard you had moved to this part of the country." At the sound of her name, the woman looked up. Her eyes met Gideon's. For a single, horrifying heartbeat, there was no recognition. There was only sheer, primal terror. Her face went white. It was the look of a cornered animal. Her hand tightened on her son's, a convulsive, protective gesture. Without a word, without buying the bread she had clearly come for, she spun around, yanking the confused boy with her, and practically fled into the street. Gideon stared after her, utterly bewildered. The baker shrugged. "Odd bird, that one. Seemed like she'd seen a ghost." Gideon turned his attention back to his purchase, a faint, inexplicable unease settling over him. He had looked briefly at the boy she was pulling, and had a fleeting thought that there was something familiar in the child's dark, serious eyes. But he dismissed it. It was the nurse's strange, panicked reaction that lingered. "I must have been mistaken," he had murmured as they left the shop, the warm loaf tucked under his arm. "She must not have recognized me after all this time." He had dismissed it then, burying the strange encounter under the weight of more important matters, and had not thought of it again for 20 years. The memory faded, leaving Gideon alone in the cold, oppressive silence of his study. He stood motionless, the present rushing back in. He consciously, deliberately, pushed the memory away once more. A meaningless event. The woman was likely mad. It has no bearing on this. His rational mind refused to see any connection. It was a bizarre but ultimately trivial encounter from the distant past, and yet it left a residue of deep, formless anxiety. The image of the nurse's terrified face haunted him. He could not understand her fear, but his guilty conscience twisted it, misinterpreting it as an omen. It was as if the murky, unknown origins of his ward were somehow tainted, dangerous. He looked out the window again, at the dark, sleeping estate that was his legacy. His attempts to control the situation had been too subtle. He had issued commands, he had made threats, but they were defying him in the shadows. His authority, the very bedrock of his existence, was being eroded by a secret love affair. The memory, unsettling as it was, solidified a new and ruthless resolve in his heart. If they would not listen to reason, if they would not bend to his will, then he would have to break them. The time for veiled threats and unwelcome suitors was over. It was time for an ultimatum.
Frost bites the edge of the morning light. A ghost of your shadow lingers in my sight. I reach for the air where you used to stand. Nothing remains but the cold in my hand. Winter's echo calling, calling through the hollow halls where we were falling. Your name, it fades like breath on glass, a fleeting song the winds will pass. The chapel bells ring, but no one's near. Their lonely toll cut sharp and clear. I whisper your name, it vanishes too, like snow that melts at the sun's first view. The silence hums, the air stands still, time's frozen, stream bends to its will. Winter's echo calling, calling through the hollows where we were falling. Your name, it fades like breath on glass, a fleeting song the winds will pass. If love could thaw the ice in my veins, would it bring you back or deepen the pain? The whispers of what we left unsaid haunt the spaces where we once tread.
1892, Surrey, House Ashdown. The morning should have felt like a beginning. Instead, Lady Amelia Ashdown stood in the withdrawing room with a stillness that didn't belong to a bride. Her gown shimmered with ivory light, yet her fingers trembled against the silk bouquet as if it was something fragile trying to escape her grasp. Outside the door, guests shuffled and whispered, that polite, controlled hum that always made Amelia feel like a painting being examined. Her marriage to Lord Harringdale was an arrangement, not a romance. She'd accepted that without protest. But as the church bells struck the hour, a pressure gathered beneath her ribs, a quiet, growing certainty that something was wrong. A footman appeared, pale around the edges. "My lady, it is time." She nodded, but her legs felt unsteady, as though the floor had shifted and no one else noticed. She whispered a quick prayer, not for love, not even for happiness, just for dignity. The carriage jolted over the stones toward Ashtonleigh Chapel, its tall windows glowing like watchful eyes. When Amelia stepped down, a soft gasp swept through the crowd as they rose. She forced her breath steady and walked. The aisle stretched long and merciless beneath her feet. She reached the altar. No groom, not a shadow of him, not a hurried footstep, not even a whisper of apology. Only an emptiness so sharp her lungs forgot how to work. A murmur rippled through the pews, not loud but enough to cut. Where is he? Surely he wouldn't. Oh, the poor girl! Heat crawled up Amelia's throat. Her vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the shock of standing alone while her life collapsed around her. She turned, searching the sea of faces, hoping, foolishly, for a glimpse of Harringdale's familiar profile. She found someone else instead, Lord Nathaniel Northwood, the Duke of Hawthorne. He sat near the front, still as carved stone, his gaze locked on her with unnerving clarity. She had seen him once before, a winter banquet where he'd danced with no one and spoken to few a man whispered about in every drawing room, ruthless, controlled, cold as the marble halls he frequented. He should not have been looking at her, but he was. And something in that gaze, steady, unreadable, made the humiliation burn deeper. Of all the people to witness her unravel, why him? Her breath hitched. She forced her chin up, but dignity felt like sand slipping through her grip. She heard the whispers rising, sharper now, less cautious. She's been abandoned. Not even a message. How humiliating! The chapel closed in around her. The candles flickered. The air thinned. Her pulse hammered a frantic beat against her stays. She tried to breathe, once, shallowly, but the breath caught halfway, breaking against the awful silence swelling inside her. Her fingers tightened around her bouquet until petals crushed beneath her glove. The world watched, and Amelia Ashdown stood at the altar, alone, fighting the first tear that threatened to fall. Somewhere in the pews, the Duke's posture shifted, barely, a subtle motion she wouldn't have noticed if she weren't desperate for something, anything, that resembled solid ground. But she had none, not a groom, not a voice to defend her, not a soul beside her, just the echo of a promise made for duty and broken without a single explanation. For a heartbeat, Amelia stood frozen at the altar, the silence pressing around her like a second skin. Her breath hitched behind her veil, and the rows of guests blurred into a single, suffocating weight. Then she felt it, a presence beside her. Not the groom, a different man, taller, steadier, a figure she recognized only from whispers and the rare glimpse at distant gatherings. The Duke of Ravensden. He did not touch her. He did not bow. He only angled his head, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Miss Ashdown," he murmured, calm where she was trembling. "Walk with me." She almost faltered. "Why?" "Because standing alone will ruin you," he said simply, "and I cannot watch that happen." The room watched them with wide, scandal-hungry eyes, but the Duke's composure held the entire chapel in place. He extended his arm, formal, proper, gloved, the gesture of a gentleman, not a lover. Her fingers trembled as she placed them atop his sleeve. A murmur rippled through the pews. He moved forward, slow, deliberate, carrying her with him, as though escorting a bride was something he had been born to do. Emilia kept her chin lifted, every step a battle against the humiliation clawing at her throat. But the Duke's stride did not waver. His presence alone felt like a shield. When they reached the chapel doors, he paused, just long enough to lower his voice again, the faintest warmth hiding beneath the veneer of formality. "You will not remember this as the day you stood abandoned," he said, "only as the day you did not fall." Her eyes burned, not from shame now, but from the unexpected steadiness of him. He guided her down the steps with impeccable decorum, opened the waiting carriage door himself, and offered his hand for her to step inside. She did. And for a single breath, one brief, suspended moment, he met her gaze through the veil. No pity, no triumph, just quiet, unmistakable resolve. Then the door shut. The carriage jolted forward, and Emilia was carried away from the chapel, away from the gasping crowd, away from the ruin the morning had threatened to leave upon her name. The last thing she saw as the horses pulled her down the lane was the Duke of Ravensden standing on the church steps, shoulders squared, ready to face the whispers meant for her. And for the first time since the bells began tolling, she did not feel forsaken. She felt protected. The morning after the ruined wedding, House Ashdown held its breath, not out of sympathy, not out of grief, but out of polite discomfort, the kind English households excelled at. Everyone avoided Emilia. She moved through the corridors like a ghost in lace, the scent of crushed roses still clinging to her gloves from where her bouquet had fallen yesterday. Every mirror she passed felt like a betrayal, catching the faint redness at the corners of her eyes, the tight line of her mouth, the girl who had stood alone in a chapel built for two. Her father tried to pretend nothing had happened. He poured tea, asked about her sleep, spoke of weather and tenants and nothing that mattered at all, but beneath his gentle tone lay something harder. Fear. A Viscount's daughter abandoned at the altar was not a small matter, and Emilia felt his anxiety in every breath. By noon, the whispers began. Servants passing outside her door, a maid who could not quite meet her eyes, a footman lowering his voice too late. Will she still receive callers? Poor girl, ruined before she's even married. She must be wed quickly. Imagine the scandal if not. Each word stabbed cleanly, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Emilia closed her door and pressed her back to it, breathing through the ache. She could survive humiliation. She could even survive heartbreak. But she could not survive becoming a burden to her father. She refused to be the reason his name was dragged through drawing rooms. For hours, she wandered the edge of the gardens alone, white gloves trailing along winter-stiff hedges, her thoughts circling the same quiet terror. What happens to a lady no one chooses? And then, a sound she didn't expect. Hoofbeats. Deep, even, expensive hoofbeats. Her breath stalled. She did not turn, not at first, as if refusing to look would make the world stay simple for another second. Only when she heard her father's surprised greeting did she pivot. Nathaniel Northwood, Duke of Hawthorne, stood in the entry hall. He was not in riding attire this time. He'd come dressed in a black morning coat, waistcoat of muted silver, and a stiff, high collar that framed the sharp line of his jaw. His hair was still wind-touched from the ride, but he looked every inch the man society whispered about. Dangerous, elegant, composed to the point of cruelty. He should not have been here. Not today. Not after what she'd endured under his gaze. Her heart collided with her ribs once, painfully. Her father bowed slightly, masking his surprise with aristocratic skill. "Your Grace, what brings you to Ashdown?" Nathaniel's eyes flickered, just barely, toward the corridor where Emilia stood half hidden. But he didn't approach her. He didn't call her name. He didn't intrude. Instead, he offered her father the most impeccable version of himself, calm, formal, respectful. "I was passing through the district," he said, voice low and even, "and thought it proper to inquire after your daughter." Emilia froze. He had not come for her, not openly. He would never humiliate her again by showing concern that could be mistaken for pity. He came with dignity, giving her the choice to approach or retreat. Her father cleared his throat. She is managing. Nathaniel gave a polite nod. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged. The kind of silence that made Amelia's pulse flutter, though she didn't understand why. He did not ask to see her. He did not impose. He simply existed there, tall and steady and devastatingly composed, as if giving her the dignity of distance. It should have comforted her. Instead, it made her feel seen. Her father shifted, uneasy, and finally said, "Emilia, come greet His Grace." Her stomach tightened. She stepped forward mechanically, hands clasped to hide their trembling. Their eyes met, and the world startled into stillness.